This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. The collected works of Marie-Louise von Franz is the forthcoming 28-volume Magnum Opus of one of the leading minds in analytical psychology. The first volume, Archetypal Symbols and Fairytales, The Profane and Magical Worlds, was released on January 4th, 2021, Dr. von Franz's 106th birthday, and is to be followed by 27 more volumes over the next 10 years. Joining us today for episode 78 are the general editors of this series, Jungian psychiatrists Drs. Stephen Buser and Leonard Cruz in Asheville, North Carolina. Dr. Buser received his MD from the Duke University School of Medicine and is a diplomat of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. He served for 12 years in the United States Air Force, where he was the sole military psychiatrist in Central and South America, was chief of a critical incidence stress debriefing team, led hostage negotiations, and specialized in war trauma evaluations and treatment. He worked in private psychiatric practice for many years before entering the clinical training program at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Along with Dr. Cruz in 2013, he acquired Chiron Publications, where he currently serves as chief publisher. Since 2018, he has been on the clinical faculty at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine, teaching medical students addiction medicine and psychiatry. Dr. Cruz holds an MD from the University of Miami School of Medicine and a graduate degree in business from Western Carolina University. After 33 years of practicing general psychiatry and psychotherapy, he shifted his clinical focus to treating substance use disorders and is currently the chief medical officer of a 72-bed state-supported substance abuse hospital. He explores how postmodern man's search for transcendent experiences can easily descend into addiction, and how utilizing myth, rites, and rituals can help support patients seeking sobriety. He currently serves as editor-in-chief and CEO of Chiron Publications. In 2008, Drs. Buser and Cruz co-founded the Asheville Jung Center, a pioneer in bringing high-quality online Jungian educational programs to a worldwide audience. They are the co-authors of DSM-5 Insanely Simplified, Unlocking the Spectrums within DSM-5 and ICD-10, and co-editors of A Clear and Present Danger, Narcissism in the Era of President Trump, Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness and the Mind of Donald Trump, and, along with Dr. Murray Stein, are the contributors to the wildly popular Map of the Soul book series, which you can learn more about on Speaking of Jung's BTS page. After several years of negotiations and preparations, Chiron Publications embarked on a 10-year-long project of publishing a newly translated collected works of Marie-Louise von Franz, and it is the subject of our talk today. Please visit the website Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, where you will find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This interview is being recorded on January 6th, 2021, through the magic of Zoom. Drs. Buser and Cruz, I really appreciate you taking the time today to join us to discuss this very exciting and highly anticipated project of yours.
Well, thank you so much for having us, Laura. It has been a delight to have stayed connected with you over the years and the amazing work you're doing in the Jungian world and the podcasts and the BTS piece. We've been connecting, from afar with the whole, BTS energy around Jung. And now we have this really exciting, new chapter, for Chiron Publications, moving into the collected works of Marie-Louise von Franz. It's daunting. There's such a large project ahead of us, yet we are very excited to be doing so.
And I echo the welcome. Thank you very much, Laura, for the opportunity to talk about this, and for your very kind words about. We agree it's a substantial project, and hopefully will have an impact on the Jungian community. So we're just delighted to be able to bring this forth.
Well, thank you both for all the work you've put into this. And I thought we would begin today with laying the groundwork first, because we've got some new listeners and they might not be familiar with Marie-Louise von Franz. So let's lay the groundwork of who she was.
Yeah, Marie-Louise von Franz was born 106 years ago, as you mentioned, and was really an amazing figure within the Jungian psychological world. Many people believe that there were two primary figures early on. The main figure, of course, was Carl Jung himself. Most believe that von Franz was number two, in the sense of she had a nearly equally brilliant mind, amazing memory, gift of language, and from a very early age, really connected with Jung, and for over 60 years continued, research and lecturing and moving the ball forward with Jungian psychology. After Carl Jung's death, she became the lead person in the Zurich Institute and really was the heir apparent of sorts and kind of moved the ball forward. So when people think of the early years of Jungian psychology, besides Carl Jung, von Franz is really the next up with that. People have called her the queen of Jungian psychology, as opposed to Carl Jung, would obviously be the king. And she was really the successor, from Jung in bringing this forward. The one thing that I found really fascinating, with von Franz is how impacted and grounded in the archetypal chaos of the early part of the century with that. The reason I say that, she was born in 1915, January 1915. And of course, World War I was 1914 to 1918. So she was born just months after World War I. Beyond that, her father was one of the chief of staffs for the Austro-Hungarian army, which obviously was part of the Axis powers with Germany. So her father was at the very highest ranks of the military in World War I. He served on the Zanzo Front, which was this bloody campaign in Italy. And of course, Germany and Austria lost World War I. So at that point, von Franz, as an infant, was nearly a refugee, fleeing Austria, trying to get to Switzerland, and had to wait on the border of Switzerland for months, trying to get a visa until she was finally able to get across. Obviously, she was an infant, so it was her father and mother bringing her across. So that's one. World War I was huge. She was in her 20s in World War II in the center of Europe. So that's a second archetypal event. The other thing I found intriguing was the Great Pandemic of 1918, 100 years ago. We all have heard probably about the Spanish flu, now, with this being the second great pandemic, since then. And her father contracted the Spanish flu and was invalid, for months, with that. So her own family was impacted dramatically from the last great pandemic. Fast forward a few years, and the Great Depression, hit, and her father was wiped out of his, family wealth, and so they became not quite penniless, but had very little money at that point. So much so that she had to self-fund her own, college education with that. So you look at these global events, and von Franz was right in the middle, of many of them. And then you add into that another piece of data I found. She had 2 surgeries before the age of 4. One was an appendectomy. And nowadays we say, well, so what? Surgery is not a big deal. But this was pre-antibiotic. So if you had a surgery in the era before antibiotics came out, that was highly dangerous. And she was, a toddler, getting significant surgeries. So part of her greatness, I wonder if it was due to this profound archetypal cauldron that she was caught up with. And that level of early suffering could really broaden somebody's soulful approach. So when you look at her writings and her teachings, she's really one of the Jungians that goes very deep into the unconscious.
If I could add, Laura, something else that I think just is so intriguing about von Franz is, she was a student of linguistics, of philology, in her undergraduate years. And it was interesting. The other day I came upon a foreword that she wrote to a book fairly late in her career and just a little before Jung died, called Aurora Consurgens. And in there, she discusses how Professor Jung essentially tapped her with the request to expound on this treatise, which was a treatise by Thomas Aquinas, written in medieval Latin. And it's one of the things I found most astounding in just reading about her life was her singular focus. It's rarely the case that a person can be so devoted in such a singular fashion to the same pursuits throughout the decades of their young adult years and on into their later years. But she, some would say that she often just did a great deal of her work at the behest of Carl Jung. But the reality is, not only did she bring an originality to that, but perhaps one of the more striking things is rarely do you find people who can be so devoted over so many years and with the humility that she had as well. So it's just striking to me that she had such a grasp of ancient languages and all the literature that she had to pour through to produce her pretty massive volumes of writings.
And at such an early age, she was a high school student when she met Carl Jung. And right after meeting him, she tells her sister that this was the most decisive encounter of my life, with that. At age 18, as a high school student, now she graduated high school a couple months later, but the fact that at that very early age, she meets Jung, gets enamored, by both him and his psychological work. And what high school students go to that level? She starts analysis at age 19. Again, very rare. Most of us are much later in our lives before we have the wisdom to see that we need psychoanalysis. And as Len was saying, the way that she paid for her analysis was by translating the Aurora Consurgens. So they had to barter because after the Great Depression, she lost her family money. She couldn't afford analysis with Jung. So she agrees to translate this alchemical ancient text at age 19 in order to pay, through the barter, her own analysis with that. At age 21, she gets invited to Ernos, which is a very prestigious yearly conference that Jung was leading. At age 29, she enters the psychology club, which was also quite an honor to get invited to be a member of that. So you see her brilliance and love of depth psychology from an extremely early age, which gives her this amazingly prolonged career, 65 years of, working on, depth Jungian psychology, which, almost nobody, has that ability. And she focuses nearly her entire life, on that work.
And I heard Peter Amen, who was a guest on this podcast last year, I heard him mention in the ISAP talk that you gave, Dr. Buser and Dr. Cruz, you were there too, along with Dr. Stein. It was about a month ago, and that is available on the Asheville Jung Center's YouTube channel, I believe. I will provide a link to that in the show notes. But I heard Dr. Amen say something very interesting, that Dr. von Franz did all this work for Jung, helped him, assisted him, and she saw analysis, and she worked as a Jungian analyst, but she was also a lecturer and a teacher, and she trained analysts at the Jung Institute. But she also contributed original material. It wasn't just all regurgitating Jung. She did her own research and contributed a lot of original material, which brings me to the books. And the main question that I keep getting asked about this collected works is what will it contain? The first volume was just released. It's titled Archetypal Symbols and Fairytales, Profane and Magical Worlds. But we have a lot to discuss about what else is included. And I was making the episode page for this interview, and I came up with actually 28 books of hers that are currently available on Amazon. Actually, one of them is in German, but the rest are in English. But there is more. So for everybody who's just patiently waiting for you to tell us what is coming, would you outline the collected works? It's going to consist of 28 volumes.
We think. We don't really know because it's a 10-year project. The reason I say that is volume 2, for example, would have been, I think, 1,200 pages if we published it in the format that it came to us from the translators. And, we can't produce a 1,200-page book. It probably wouldn't even hold together. So suddenly 27 volumes became 28 volumes because we had to split a book in two. Some of the books we might end up joining together. There may be one that's only 180 pages, and we say, you know what, let's bring that together. So when we say 28 volumes, we need to keep in mind that it's really a work in progress. And that's the best guess for now, but we could certainly go up or down, but it'll be pretty close to that. One part of your question is, where's the material coming from? It's definitely not just grabbing the books that have been available, over the years and pulling together in collected volumes. There's a lot of material, probably a quarter to a third of it, that hasn't been published in English, so far. And the first 5 volumes are a good example of this. The first five volumes are a redone piece of her work. When she was in her mid-20s, she spent 9 years working on Fairytales, her very kind of first diving into that, and wrote what's going to be 5-volume series on Fairytales, just diving very, very deeply into them. But the person that was in charge of the work was actually paying her to do the work, Hedwig von Beit, took credit for her work and put her own name on the books. And over the years, it was really determined that von Franz had written these, and von Beit did very little. So these first 5 volumes, have never been released, with von Franz as the rightful author in English. So this is new material, and so you really get a window into the early von Franz and how she developed her fairy tale, theories kind of over the years. And with that,
I'm going to jump in here because I'd like to have you elaborate on that. So when von Franz was around the age of 20, she began writing symbolism of fairy tales. And she wrote for about 8 years. And then a German scholar actually paid her. Did she write those for this scholar, or did she just write them and then the scholar came along and said, hey, I'll pay you for those and I will publish them myself?
Now, she wrote them as a pay job, in essence. She was being paid for 8-9 years to help von Beit write this material. But
Steve, wasn't it the case that it was anticipated that she would be credited for her work?
Right, exactly. And there was this controversy when the works came out in 1952. She was barely mentioned in an acknowledgement of, thanks for some of the work you did, even though she wrote 90 to 95% of the material in there. She was contemplating a lawsuit, and was about to sue. And actually, Carl Jung himself talked her out of it, thought it'd be unhelpful for the Jungian community to get embroiled in the lawsuit. But it was controversial back in the 50s and laid low for the next 50, 60 years until the foundation that controls the works of von Franz said, you know what, we need to right this wrong and bring out this material, not just in German, but also in English now, and correct the authorship of it.
So that did not happen in her lifetime then. Those 3 volumes were published from 1952 to 1957 in German. I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce it, but it translates into Symbolism of Fairytales.
Yep.
And then in 2011, the Foundation for Jungian Psychology acquired the copyright and restored Dr. von Franz as the rightful author. And
Right.
in 2015, it was released in German. Okay, so then you're saying that then those 3 volumes are the first 5 volumes of this new collected works?
Exactly. Except volume 4 and 5 aren't translated yet.
Okay.
So they'll be numbered volumes 1 through 5, but we're going to publish 1 through 3, and then we jump to, I think, 6 and 7. So we'll be jumping around depending where the translations are. The other exciting thing about this is these are new translations, in essence. So even the books that have already been released in English, which is a good number of them, but by no means all of them, those books are being retranslated from the original German, with that.
With considerable footnoting as well.
With a lot of scholarship and footnoting and indexing. Right. So
and another exciting aspect is, I think in volume 6 is going to be the visions of Nicholas von Flue, and that's I think will be the first time it appears in English. So that's a highly anticipated thing. And for those who don't know, that was a saint from the 1400s in Switzerland, who I think it was maybe in his 5th decade of life, had a series of visions in which I think it essentially conveyed to him that he had allowed his worldly pursuits to overtake his spiritual life. And so from that point onward, I think he left his family and devoted himself entirely to the contemplative life. And again, that volume is available in German, but has never been translated to English.
And that will be volume 6.
That will be volume 6, but as Steve was mentioning, it won't appear after the 5th volume. It'll probably appear after the 3rd volume while we await translation of...
Later this year. If everything goes right, we'll be doing volume 2 and 3 in the next 4 to 6 months. And then by the second half of the year, we'll be working on volumes 6 and 7, if we're able to continue the pace that we anticipate.
And the first 3 volumes are already named. As I mentioned, the first volume is Archetypal Symbols and Fairytales, the Profane and Magical Worlds. Volume 2 will be titled Archetypal Symbols and Fairytales, the Hero's Journey. And Volume 3, Archetypal Symbols and Fairytales, the Maiden's Quest.
So the second and third volumes are the Hero's Journey and the Maiden's Quest. And at first glance, many think, oh, well, we know about that, Joseph Campbell and Robert Johnson. Mm-hmm. But then you think about it, well, wait a minute, von Franz, wrote these in her 20s. So, this work, predates the majority of that. So this is some of the original Jungian conceptions of the hero's journey and the maiden's quest, which later on, was picked up by other Jungians over the years. So we're really getting to the roots and the history and how this material came out. And Fairytales is really one of the main areas von Franz was known for. There were quite a few areas, as you mentioned earlier. She did a lot of original contributions. Fairytales, probably the biggest. Alchemy, along with Carl Jung, was a big one. Then things like time, numbers, synchronicity, death, life after death. These were all areas that she spent, a lot of time and expertise on. And Fairytales, the biggest. So as we begin these first 5 volumes and we dive into the fairy tales that she has been researching, again, you get that early snapshot of von Franz and how she was developing her theories and seeing the depth that she goes into. In a single volume 1, she mentions 863 fairy tales. Not that she analyzes all of them, but she analyzes quite a few. The depth and brilliance of her mind is just astounding as you see her kind of go through these fairy tales.
In reading this first volume, even when we received it as the manuscript, I have to say it's really quite a bit of effort to read through hundreds of fairy tales. If you just think of it as just a succession of different stories. But one thing that comes from the immersing yourself in the text, that although I know this, and I've certainly been instructed about this, that the fact that you read 800, was it Steve, fairy tales that have some coherence to them, and the coherence that you begin to realize is the idea that Jung really discovered and proposed to all of us of there being a collective level of the unconscious. It really comes through in a meaningful way when you exert yourself to read through hundreds of fairy tales and realize that these motifs and these themes recur over and over again across different epochs in time and across different cultures. I mean, we can hear that as a theoretical construct, but I really did find it powerful to go through the effort of reading these endless numbers of stories. And the idea that I never had the illusion that I would remember all these tales in a way that I could recount the ones that we all grew up with or familiar, like Grimm's fairy tales. But to know that those themes are so consistent that even if in the telling of a story, you might leave out a detail here or a little element there, you begin to realize the power that those narratives have for all of us, and that what Jung discovered was really quite a remarkable thing that had been staring us in the face forever. It just took somebody to be able to put that to words and identify it.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask both of you is, why are fairy tales important?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. And it's a great question because we see von Franz spending decades and decades of her life diving into these fairy tales, and not just reading a book of Grimm's tales, but going through thousands and thousands of fairy tales. What Carl Jung and von Franz, and of course many other Jungians, have discovered over the years is that fairy tales, much like dreams, hold the collective wisdom and really the collective unconscious, within them. They developed gradually over the eons and really tapped into primal archetypes, our primal fears, the arcane, and by studying them, we get a sense of the universal, patterns within life, with that. And you see this with von Franz diving into it. I mean, she also has this gift to make the extraordinarily complex, really, fathomable with that. Murray Stein on that one lecture we had just a few weeks ago gave this marvelous statement of von Franz that the very first time he heard her speaking at the Jung Institute in Zurich, he was blown away by her. He felt as if God, himself or herself, was speaking, and this wisdom was just flowing from von Franz, without any notes, and her ability just to weave it all together. And you see that developing and coming together, in these first volumes of her fairy tales. In volume 1, she not just goes through all these endless fairy tales, but does so and organizes them in ways that she brings out these themes. The first third of the book is talking about the background elements of a fairy tale, how a fairy tale can resemble a mandala in its orientation and its geography, how the sky, the moon, the background, the forest, the mountains, each hold these pretty profound archetypal symbolisms. Then in the second part, she divides each of the characters, the main characters, besides the hero or heroine, into this quaternity of others. That
was very interesting. I heard you mention that and outline it and spend a considerable amount of time on it during the ISAP talk, the 4 archetypal others.
Exactly. That most of us, when I was reading a fairy tale before this, I wasn't thinking along those lines. I was just thinking about the bear or the king or the wizard in it. But once you have her patterns down of, you have the hero and the heroine, and that person is engaging others within the tale. And then she spends a lot of time on the discernment of magic, because all fairy tales have magic in them. Speaking animals, enchanted rings, swords, timelessness. And wherever the magical pieces are, in volume 1, she describes that as where the archetypes are. So if there's a magical figure, a magical element, that becomes archetypal. That's where the collective unconscious archetypes are poking through the mundane world we live in and breaking into this enchanted kingdom of the fairy tale. And then she goes even further and says, whenever the hero is engaging an other person, there's 4 possibilities of the other person that she's engaging with. And those 4 options are mother, father, son, daughter. But she goes into a whole lot more detail. The father is this daimonic, powerful father, the king. The mother could be the great mother or the evil kind of wicked stepmother. The son holds the shadow element, the demonic shadow emissary. And then the daughter carries this magical anima kind of maiden piece. And when you read a fairy tale with that background, and that's just from the first volume, you've got 5 more or 4 more to go through, you start hearing these elements. There's going to be this hero's quest we'll learn about next volume. There'll be a maiden's journey. There's the background of the enchanted kingdom of the fairy tale. And there's the great mother and father and the emissaries and the shadow and anima that the heroine is engaging kind of through it. And it really does take it into a new life. Instead of Hansel and Gretel just being Hansel and Gretel, suddenly the evil stepmother becomes alive and the witch, and you start putting these elements into their proper place.
Okay, so the daemonic father, the great mother, the daemonic shadow son, and the magical anima daughter. Would you explain to our listeners what the word daemonic means?
Right, because when you first read that or hear it, especially as a male, I want to say, wait a minute, the masculine ones are demonic and the feminine ones are magical and great. But that's not at all what she means. And it sort of interplays, because there can be daimonic, mother. But daimon isn't demonic. Daimonic refers to sort of an ancient concept of godlike deities and emissaries that sometimes help the heroine and sometimes trip them up and have a trickster energy to them. So a daimon isn't necessarily a bad thing like a demon typically is seen as. And if we run into a magical male being that has a daimon energy to him, or a female that's got daimon, it could be either one, but she focuses on the male, we need to pay attention because that's, again, an archetypal presence. And that daimon is coming from the unconscious. And if we ignore it, that's the worst thing we can do, because the unconscious ignored leads typically in a fairy tale to catastrophe with that. And vice versa, if we listen to the daimon, even if we go against it, but we listen to it, respect it, hear its wisdom or its warning, typically the hero will have a positive outcome and find the maiden or kill the dragon or whatever the quest is, for the heroine.
I'd also like to suggest that there's 2 other reasons that come to my mind for why fairy tales and what's so important that we would give them our attention. And one of them is, I think it's useful to remember that we're looking at this through our adult eyes, but for the most part, our first encounters with fairy tales happen when we're very young and very impressionable, and when we still have a sense of the magic and the mystery of life. So I think it's interesting to me to consider the parallel ideas that do fairy tales sort of imbue in us certain engrams and certain patterns of the way we'll experience our worlds in the future. And what comes to mind in that regard was when my daughters were quite young, I often would tell them bedtime stories in which the main themes were a little girl whose grandmother or one of the elders had taught an ancient language, and then a dragon would come into the village, and all the adults in the village would be terrified until the little girl went out into the court in the square and then would speak the name of the dragon and bind it. And the whole time I was doing it with great intention to let them know that, there's all sorts of dragons and ferocious elements in our psyche that once you can name them, you may be able to bind them. And to this day, even in their young adult years, they remember those stories powerfully. So it often leads me to wonder, do we, to some extent, tell fairy tales as a way of transmitting the main motifs of culture, or and maybe it's both at the same time, are there already patterns that the fairy tales are just reflecting? So that's one feature I think warrants the study of them. And then the other, I think, is that, I think it's fair to say that for anybody who reflects on their life, it's very easy to come to the realization that in the vastness of the universe, our personal stories can be looked at as sort of puny and small. But on hearing a fairy tale in which you feel some of those themes of your own life elevated, I think it has certain meaningful redemptive qualities to realize that you're also part of a much larger drama of which your story is now reflected in these great stories.
And Dr. Buser, you mentioned there are 863 different fairy tales that are mentioned just in this first volume alone, which is 608 pages. And I was wondering about the cultural motifs. These are cross-cultural, right?
Mm-hmm. They really are. And it's so impressive to read von Franz diving into the cross-cultural elements long before that was fashionable. Right now, if you did a Eurocentric book on fairy tales, you'd really get some scorn from the public, because we realize now that it's so much bigger than just white European culture. But here, almost 100 years ago, von Franz knew that in her core, and the vast majority of the fairy tales aren't European. I mean, they're Eskimo and they're Indian and they're Hindu. They're all over the map. And it's interesting that our bias is so woven into it. As I'm reading the fairy tale, if it's a Eskimo fairy tale, I'm struggling. I'm having a hard time, keeping the characters straight and this and that. And when it's an English fairy tale, I kind of know it right away with that. Now, maybe that's because I've heard, the Brother Grimm's tales over the years. But it forces you to dive deeper and broader, with that, and start trying to resonate with these other cultural, fairy tales besides just the Greek and the Brother Grimm. And really the vast majority are not, European. It's quite striking.
So I would actually like to back up, because what I neglected to ask you was how this came to be, how you, Doctors Buser and Cruz, came to acquire maybe these volumes in order to have Chiron be the publisher.
It was a very long-term process, and I'm going to hear Dr. Cruz's view on it in a moment. What I've noticed is that when it first came to us in 2013, even at that point, Murray Stein, who had been the owner of Chiron, prior to us, gave us a forward note of, guys, we've been trying for the last 10 years to try to pull this deal together with the collected works of von Franz. It's been challenging. There's been a lot of roadblocks. But you guys own Chiron now. Good luck with it. He met us in Zurich. We flew to Zurich to try to keep this going. But even in 2013, we made some progress. We got to know the foundation, a little bit better. But it is so large and so complex, and so many copyrights out there, and so many publishers and translators, and different members, right? Because it's not a single person making the decision. It's a foundation.
Well, I'd like to jump in. And you mentioned the foundation, and I mentioned it briefly earlier. So you were working with the Foundation for Jungian Psychology, which is in Küsnacht, and they own the publishing rights for Dr. von Franz?
They're the literary heirs. And for a while, it was split. It was half owned by the foundation and half by Emmanuel Kennedy, who was deeply connected to von Franz. And then a few years back, it was sold or transferred over. So the foundation is the sole literary heir for the works of von Franz. And that may have been part of what, helped it move forward, because there was, less cooks in the kitchen, in essence. Mm-hmm. But so there's a literary heir, which is a foundation. But there were so many complexities and uncertainties, and also everyone in the project, ourselves included, but especially the foundation, really wanted to honor von Franz and the unconscious in this process. So there'd be a number of times where I would call Hans-Uli Eder, who was kind of the lead person for me, contact at the foundation. And I would tell him where we're at, what we'd like to do. He would say, Steve, that's excellent. Let me dream about it for a few days, mm-hmm. And I'll get back to you. And he would literally wait, typically a few weeks, listen to his dreams. And then if his dream said, well, now it's not quite time, or we need to do something else, he would kind of hold off. And this last time, I actually had a dream. And so I told Hans-Uli Eder my dream. And then Hans-Uli, let his dreams build up. And at some point, there was a collective consensus that the unconscious wanted this to proceed as well. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't just a list of check off things that needed to occur. We need the rights for this book. We need the translations available. The foundation and Chiron, we were trying to honor the unconscious process that von Franz was so dedicated. She dedicated her entire life to allowing the unconscious to work, through her and her pupils.
And she said, was it at the end of her life or toward the end of her life, that she did want her collected works to be published?
She did. That was her desire with that. And that was really the driving impotence of the foundation and us to try to honor that as well.
And Dr. Cruz, did you want to tell us your experience of how this came to be?
I love the way Steve described the process, because at various points it did feel as though, particularly when we traveled to Zurich and met with the foundation's literary agent that they had hired, it felt as though there was a vetting going on of Steve and myself, and also of Chiron. But it was a vetting like nothing I would have anticipated. It had much less to do with the hard numbers and the things that you would normally think of that would happen in the publishing domain. It really was more of a sense of where we, and I say it because it, I think, put a heavy onus on Steve and I to make sure that we fulfill that desire that the foundation had, that this be done in an honorific manner. So we're committed to staying alive for the next 10 years and pursuing this.
Indeed.
I was just looking here for a quote by Dr. Kennedy about the first volume, and I can't find it now, about how it's not to be read, but it's to be studied.
Right. I don't have the quote in front of me either, but you're exactly right. This is no easy bedtime reading. It is a scholarly work that needs to be studied, pondered, absorbed into the unconscious. And it's very true. When I was reading this work, if I just tried to skim through it like it was a easy text to read, I would get lost and couldn't move forward. But if you really dive into it and see it as this amazing scholarly work of von Franz and her early years pulling together the Fairytales, then it really becomes alive.
I'd like to mention another book that both of you have published through Chiron. It is titled The Fountain of the Love of Wisdom, an homage to Marie-Louise von Franz. It was edited by Emmanuel Kennedy, and it is wonderful. I love it. It consists of death announcements. This is all on von Franz. Death announcements, obituaries, internet responses, eulogies, birthday addresses, personal impressions, book reviews, publishers' comments. There's a lot of biographical data, photos, lists of her published works in English, and contributions from Jung's grandson, Dieter Baumann, from Anne Maguire, Gilda France, Daryl Sharp, Murray Stein. When did you publish that book?
It was actually before us. It was Chiron, but we took Chiron over in 2013. Murray Stein, Nathan Schwartz-Salant stepped down, asked us to take it up. So that was 2013. I think it was 2006 was the copyright publication date of Fountain of Love and Wisdom. So it was a number of years before us. And
so that was before you. I'm sorry. Okay.
I had almost forgotten about that volume. I had seen it and looked through it way back when we first took over Chiron. And then I was preparing that talk for ISAP, and I thought, gosh, I wish I had some good photos of von Franz and some good material. And then I thought, Steve, you're so stupid. The bookshelf behind you has a book with all that in it. So I turned around and found the book, and sure enough, it has this treasure trove of delightful images and anecdotes, and it really allowed me to dive into von Franz in a different way, not just a biography of facts and data, but boy, you really get the spirit of von Franz in that book.
I can't remember if it was Murray or maybe it was John Hill when we were in Zurich and that book came up, Steve. But I recall somebody telling us that, one of the challenges with that was they had to select from, so that very massive volume, I don't remember, it's probably 600 pages plus.
At least, it might be more.
Represents just those contributions that they felt they wanted to include, and there were apparently considerably more testaments and memorials that people had written.
Yeah, it is almost 600 pages, and I do want to mention for the astrologers out there, there are a lot of Jungian astrologers that are listeners of this podcast. There is a chapter on the horoscope of Marie-Louise von Franz with her birth data and her astrological chart. It is on page 339. I'm looking for it here. This chapter was written by Therese Lotzker. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it also includes the birth chart of C.G. Jung, and then a combined chart of von Franz and Jung. It is the Synastry horoscope. That's on page 341. I will provide a link to this book, The Fountain of the Love of Wisdom, in the show notes for this episode. Dr. Buser, you included a slide in the ISAP talk, and it included what I was thinking was a sneak peek into some of the other volumes. You both mentioned volume 6 on Nicholas von Flew, volume 7 on Aurora Consurgens, and volume 8. Now, volume 8 you listed as Interpretation of Fairytales / Animus and Anima. So will volume 8 be on fairytales as well?
Yes, and in fact, quite a number of the other books will be on fairytales. That was such a focus of her life's work, not the sole one, but a good chunk of it, that probably maybe not quite a third, but a number of the books will be. The / refers to 2 books combined with that one.
Okay,
because these were already published in English. There'll be again a fresh translation for them, but the Interpretation of Fairytales was a book that von Franz wrote. Then Animus and Anima in Fairytales was another book. So those 2 books retranslated will be combined into a single volume in volume 8 for that.
Okay, and on that slide you also listed Alchemy, The Way of the Dream, Redemption in Fairytales, Puer Aeternus, The Golden Ass, Divination and Synchronicity, and Time, Rhythm, and Repose.
And you're right; those were just a sneak peek. Okay. I didn't want to put up everything because when it's not fully set, and we're still kind of working some things out. But I did want to throw out some excitement of there's some really neat volumes kind of coming up, and they're all going to be neat. But they were just some that I wanted to whet people's appetites with and let them know it would be coming in the not too distant future.
So let's use this one as an example. Alchemy. There is a book that was published by Inner City Books titled Alchemy, an Introduction, that was based on von Franz's lectures. And now, will that volume in this collected works on alchemy be that book retranslated? I actually think that those lectures were delivered in English. So how will that work?
Right. So the published material that was initially in German is cleaner in that sense of it'll just come directly over with that. That's volume 18 currently, Alchemy, an Introduction to Symbolism, again, the Psychology. And you're right, that is already published. I'm fairly certain the foundation has acquired the various copyrights, for those, even for the ones that aren't being retranslated, with that.
Okay.
That said, we have the big picture, but we're not able to hone in yet because we haven't received the transcripts, the manuscripts, we don't have the full material yet.
Okay.
We didn't get the chance to fly out to Zurich as we were hoping, this last year for obvious COVID reasons. So to be honest, we're focusing on the first few volumes. But you're right. The ones that were originally in English, I would suspect won't be substantially altered. The footnotes probably will be in some of the scholarly indexing. But most likely the foundation will keep those more intact if their first language was English. But even that we have yet to see. We haven't received those manuscripts at all.
And Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought also that there may occasionally be unpublished material that the foundation has rights to that might be incorporated into different volumes that on the surface might appear identical to previous published material, but they may actually incorporate other unpublished material or lecture.
Yeah, there is a lot of material out there, and the foundation itself is in the home of von Franz. Before she died, she deeded the home over to the foundation, and they have a archive there that they've pulled together a lot of her work. So while we don't have specifics yet on that volume, I wouldn't all be surprised if there's new material that's added to that as well.
So right now, the first volume is available in hardcover on Amazon and also on your website, chironpublications.com. And then there is a paperback edition coming out later in the spring. Is that right?
Should be about 6 months, 5 to 6 months. We're taking the more traditional publishing approach of releasing the hardcover initially and then paperback, partly because it's such a momentous collection. We felt having the hardcover as the primary initially would sort of honor that piece a little bit more so.
Oh, I love that. I love hardcover books.
And especially with this, because it's a 28 volume set, and there's something about having a bookshelf that's devoted to a singular collected work series, and having the hardcover, it's kind of lined up there, and just having the corpus of von Franz there. It's different when it's paperback. I don't know why, but for me, the hardcover holds a little more mythos and logos when it's right there on the shelf.
Yes, I agree.
There was one thing I wanted to say, which was a quote from von Franz from volume 1, which she gets at a number of times in different ways. And it's that she saw fairy tales as holding a core secret in each fairy tale. And she talks about it on two levels. One, sort of a global secret of all fairy tales contain a secret. And then she kind of lays it out in the volume. And what she says in the global sense is fairy tales give the hero or heroine a choice to engage and listen to the unconscious or to ignore it and go a different way. And universally, when we listen to the unconscious and take in what it's trying to tell us, our world becomes better. We may not be wealthy and famous, but we are more genuine, and we have good fortune in our lives. And to the degree that we miss that opportunity, we don't. And so that was part of the global nature of fairy tales. But then she also says that each individual fairy tale has its own core secret. And as she's going through these fairy tales, part of what you see her doing is setting the stage with background and time and Enchanted Kingdom and the archetypes, but then also trying to pull together what is the core secret that the unconscious is trying to bring forth in this fairy tale. And it's just a delight to see her doing so.
That's beautiful, the core secret that the unconscious is trying to bring forward. That's it. Well, would you like to end it there?
Yeah, thank you so much for guiding this so beautifully. This was a hard interview because it's so big. And even when I was putting my notes together of, gosh, what do I want to tell Laura? There's so many veins you can go down, and it's this gigantic 20-volume series, and von Franz's life was so huge. And this volume has 800 fairy tales. How do you encapsulate it? But I think you did, really well. So I appreciate
you did, and I appreciate that. And hopefully this will whet people's appetite to purchase the book. And so with that, I will read the outro. If you'll just stay with me for a couple more minutes. Mm-hmm. Okay. Please visit the website Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed in this episode. There you will also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. This podcast is also available on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, and now on Amazon Music. And it will be available later in the week on our YouTube channel, Jungian Laura. You can also listen to this podcast on your Amazon Echo device simply by saying, Alexa, play Speaking of Jung on Apple Podcasts. Just be sure to pronounce Jung with a hard J. Links to Amazon's new Echo devices can be found in the show notes. So with special thanks to everyone at Chiron Publications, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.